Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. My name is Dylan, and we're back. I've decided to pivot slightly with the podcast. In the past, I've recorded 2 episodes that were long form. There was one on Russia, one on China. These currently sit in the Geopolitics database, which you can find through my Substack at Geopolitics Explained, and they also sit on various podcast platforms. I've decided that the Geopolitics Explained podcast will come out every week, and for those who read the Geopolitics and Markets Review that comes out every Monday, you'll find the other news section. Every Saturday, which is when the Geopolitics Explained podcast will come out every week, I'm going to dive deeper into one of those other news topics. This week, I've decided that I'm going to discuss the current crisis in Venezuela and Guyana and the Essequibo region. But before we get into that, just a few things I want to discuss first. First of all, thank you for choosing to listen to my podcast. I'm very aware that there's a lot of information out there, not even just in geopolitics, but in general. So I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with me. Secondly, if you enjoy the episode of this podcast, I'd appreciate it massively if you headed over to Spotify and gave a review, or headed over to YouTube and gave it a like, a comment, or a subscribe. Finally, if you do enjoy this episode of the Geopolitics Explained podcast, there's a lot more over on the Substack at Geopolitics Explained. If you subscribe over there, you will get a post sent directly to your email every Monday and every Thursday, and you'll also receive the Geopolitics Explained podcast on Saturdays going forward. Without further ado, let's dive into exploring Venezuela, Guyana, and the Essequibo region. Like most areas of the world, Guyana and the Essequibo region were susceptible to European colonialism. The Dutch, the French, and the British have all colonised Guyana, and the Spanish are a very big part in this story. One reason for this, if you think of any major city that has quite a rich history, many of them sit on rivers. Most historic civilizations settled near rivers because it gave them access to water that they needed to drink for farming. In Guyana, the Demerara River and the Essequibo River are 2 such rivers. This attracted the European colonisers to Guyana, especially for sugarcane along the borders of the river. Outside of this, we'll start in 1796. Essequibo was occupied by the British. 380 sugarcane plantations sat on the banks of the Demerara and the Essequibo rivers by 1800. It's a classic example of colonialism for resource extraction. Now, the British were present in Guyana, but they actually came to acquire the territory through a treaty with the Dutch in 1814. Now, at the same time, the Essequibo River acted as a border with Venezuela, which was controlled by colonial Spain. That's where Spain comes into this story. We fast forward to 1830. Venezuela was granted independence by colonial Spain. The Venezuelans chose to adopt borders claimed by the Spanish This included the Essequibo region. In response to this, the British combined the regions of Demerara and Essequibo with another region that was under a separate administration, but still British territory, called Berbice. They decided to call this territory British Guyana. Now, after this, border tensions and border disputes really started to rise. Around this time, there existed a German-born surveyor and naturalist called Robert Schomburg. Now, Robert actually worked alongside Great Britain, and in 1835, he claimed an additional 30,000 square miles of Venezuelan territory should have been Guyanan. This became known as the Schomburg Line, and it's this line that's still debated today. Now, in 1850, to reduce tensions, the British and Venezuela agreed not to colonise the disputed Essequibo region, but they didn't determine where a specific borderline should have been drawn. Tensions dropped for a while until, as we see in the current crisis with oil existing, there was another resource that led to increased tensions between the British and the Venezuelans. Back in 1876, this resource was gold. Now, there existed gold mines in the Cuyuni Basin. This was Venezuelan territory beyond the Schomburg Line, but the territory had a high percentage of British habitation. It was during this time when these mines were being expanded that Venezuela reiterated its claim on Essequibo, and the Brits responded by claiming the entire Cuyuni Basin where the gold mines were situated. Now, this led to a low point in relations between the British and the Venezuelans. Diplomatic relations were completely severed, and Venezuela cited the Monroe Doctrine to the US, hoping that the US would intervene. Now, the Monroe Doctrine details a US foreign policy position at the time, which was against European colonialism. Unfortunately for Venezuela, the US never got involved, which is likely something they've not forgotten even to this day. Now, in 1895, the British and the Venezuelans sought to end this dispute. This tribunal voted in Britain's favour. This means that the Schomburg Line was officially established as the border between Venezuela and British Guyana, with two small deviations. One such deviation was that the British had possession of all the gold mines in the Cuyuni Basin. Now, in 1966, the conflict between Venezuela and the UK over the border was finally resolved, or so we thought, in the Geneva Agreement, which was signed by both Venezuela and the UK. This agreement also detailed Guyanan independence from Britain. 5 months after this, Venezuelan troops rolled into Guyana and occupied the Ancocco Island, among others. Now, tensions remained high for a few years. In the 1970s, Presidents Caldera of Venezuela and Burnham of Guyana signed a 12-year moratorium of Venezuela's claim on Essequibo. This drastically reduced tensions for the 12 years, but in 1983, the moratorium wasn't re-signed The current president of Venezuela is called Maduro. Before this, the Venezuelan president was Hugo Chavez. Now, Hugo Chavez did a lot of good work towards these intentions with Guyana. In 2004, he stated that the dispute over the border between Venezuela, Guyana, and the Essequibo region is finished. Now, Chavez died in 2013, and this saw Maduro rise to power. Since Maduro's rise in 2013, aggression has rose. Both Guyana and Venezuela have seized oil exploration vessels of the other, and Venezuela has continued its aggression against ExxonMobil regarding the oil exploration in Guyana's territorial waters. Prior to this year, the previous year that saw very high tensions was 2021. Now, 2021 is interesting because it is the year that Venezuela claimed 200 nautical miles of seabed, which was Guyanan territory, and coincidentally is the territory that includes most of the Guyanan oil. Also in 2021, Venezuelan boats captured 2 Guyanan vessels and flew 2 fighter jets over the Guyanan border into Guyanan territory. In October of this year, we started to see Venezuela build up its military on the border with Guyana. They built a runway near the border, as well as new roads and bridges. One member of the Venezuelan government described this move as our Guyanese roots. Now that's quite worrying, and who knows what the Venezuelans are thinking when it comes to this military build-up on the border. One country who did respond is the United States. On the surface, this might seem peculiar. The United States actually eased sanctions on Venezuela. Now, this will provide Venezuela with no limitations on its oil exports for 6 months. The reason that the United States has made this deal is, in return, Maduro has stated that the next Venezuelan elections due for next year will be fair, and that the Venezuelan government will release opposition leaders and political prisoners. This doesn't appear to have worked, because on the 6th of December, the Venezuelan government called for the arrest of 15 opposition leaders, with no evidence provided for this whatsoever. It appears that the US's strategy hasn't worked. The biggest development this month has been the referendum that Maduro decided to propose to the Venezuelan people. Now, some of the questions included in this referendum were, firstly, do citizens oppose territorial claims of Guyana? And secondly, would they be in favour of giving Venezuelan nationality to around 125,000 people who live in Guyana Essequibo? Now, this referendum passed on the 3rd of December, but with some quite large aspects that still need to be discussed. So there were whispers of a low turnout in the election and falsified results. 95% of voters said yes to each of the questions. This is quite peculiar when Maduro's approval rating, according to an article from Chatham House, currently sits at 23%. The economy has shrunk by 75% during his presidency, and inflation in Venezuela as of November 2023 was 282.8%. Looking at this situation from an overall point of view, and it appears to me that the US and Brazil, who have also lined up troops on the border with Venezuela, are trying to play a game of deterrence. It remains to see if this works, and Maduro's political future is in question. So he wants to make a strong move that he can paint as a success. Now, the fact that Venezuela seemingly went back on its deal with the United States is a worry. That the Maduro government called for the arrest of 15 opposition leaders after they promised the United States that they would run fair elections seems to be Maduro coming up with a contingency plan if he doesn't get voted again to power in the Venezuelan election. It's a very interesting topic, one that is still developing, and I wanted to provide the background information and the centuries of history that provide context to this current issue. Thank you for listening to this update on the current crisis in Venezuela-Guyana over the Essequibo region. If you have any questions, there are two places that you can go to. First of all, you can head to the YouTube comment section. Second of all, you can head to the Substack. You can subscribe there, and you can respond to any email that I send out, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. I'm aware that when I'm discussing topics like this in an audio-only podcast, that it can be quite difficult to provide sources. If you head into the description for this episode, you will find many of the sources that I used to collect this information together included there. And as I said, you can also go to YouTube or Substack, send me any questions. I'd love to answer them. Okay, thank you. I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.